by taking that kind of story and using it to your advantage, but then also Andrew Lloyd Webber has done so much in the contemporary theater world, so being able to take his expertise in that and infuse that into the opera really creates this original blend that is hard to copy. I guess. Welcome to Off Book. In each episode this season, we'll be taking a look at a different musical and breaking down the music and story of the show to try to understand what makes it so popular. And today, that musical is Phantom of the Opera, which is, as of the date that I recorded this, the longest running Broadway musical ever. It started previews in 1985 and opened at Her Majesty's Theatre in London 1 year later in 1986. That production would close in 2010, but a 25th anniversary production would start in 2011. 2012 held a new UK tour, along with another UK tour in 2019. Phantom also opened on Broadway in 1988, where it's been playing ever since. It's also been shut down due to COVID, but they've announced that they will come back when it's safe to do so. Phantom of the Opera is also one of very few Broadway musicals to get a sequel. Love Never Dies didn't do quite as well. One fan took to a Facebook group for the show to say that, quote,
virtually everything about the show strikes us as illogical, irrational, offensive, and frankly, stupid.
High praise. The original Phantom, though, has received worldwide praise. How is that? Let's dive in. The story of Phantom of the Opera is very interesting because it's a story that's pretty similar to most operas. You have this girl, you have this guy that she's in love with, and you also have this other guy who's kind of trying to win her love, despite the fact that she's in love with another guy. But also, it's different because, you know, there's a phantom. There's a ghost guy, the Phantom of the Opera. That's the name of the show. And so by taking this very familiar plot of an opera, you know, most people have kind of heard one opera or don't know about operas at least. And so by taking this very familiar thing that is the opera, and then utilizing its strengths, but also reinventing it to fit a more contemporary musical theater world, and changing the idea so it's not just another opera, it is the Phantom. And you know, it's the lore of the Phantom. Every theater has a ghost. Ask anybody that works in theater, they'll tell you there's probably a ghost in the theater. Some are joking, some actually believe it, but it's a pretty common theater myth that there are ghosts haunting every theater. So it makes sense that there would be a Phantom of the Opera. And the characters in the story initially don't believe that the Phantom is real. You know, they've talked about the stories and they've heard all the lore, but they think that it's just a story. And so when they find out, oh no, he is real, it becomes, you know, this entirely different story. And so by taking that real world kind of attitude towards the Phantom and a real world genre, and taking a story that seems familiar and then turning it on its head by making the Phantom real, and then kind of changing the story of the opera so it still feels like an opera and still fits within the parameters of what an opera traditionally is, but also has a lot of the earmarks of contemporary musical theater in terms of voice parts and in terms of storylines. You know, it's a 2-act show instead of a 8-act show. Some operas are very long, and probably some short operas too, but you know, I digress. It becomes this thing that really no one else has been able to do because it is something that is very unique. You don't often find opera on Broadway, aside from maybe, you know, 1 or 2 opera-ish belts. And so by taking that kind of story and using it to your advantage, but then also Andrew Lloyd Webber has done so much in the contemporary theater world, so being able to take his expertise in that and infuse that into the opera really creates this original blend that is hard to copy because it's so him. It's exactly what he knows. It's not his original story, it's kind of based on a novel, but to be fair, most musicals are based on something else, whether it's direct like a film or a book, or indirect like it's inspired by an opera. You know, Rent was inspired by an opera, Wicked was inspired by a book. You know, most things are inspired by something because that's what creativity is. That's another story. Something that I find really cool about this show is that it's very character-based. And, you know, every show is technically character-based. It's about characters doing things. But the plot of this show is really just, hey, the Phantom is in love with Christine, and Christine's in love with this other guy, and they're fighting about it. There are some subplots, whatever, but that's pretty much the entire plot. There aren't a lot of huge events that happen, and there aren't a lot of huge events that happen by characters other than our leads. Most of the action and the drama comes from our kind of 3 main characters, the Phantom, Christine, and Merle. And pretty much all the plot points, major or minor, happen directly because of something that they caused. They made a choice, which caused this other character to make a choice, which caused this other character to make a choice there isn't a lot of outside interference by the characters or by the world, or it isn't like, oh, rent is due today and we don't have rent. It's, I decided to kidnap Christine, and so therefore Raul's gonna come and try to get her. So it seems very organic, because all of the plot points that you're seeing are happening as a direct result of the choices that these characters are making. And that feels a lot like real life in a way. There's definitely nothing wrong with outside forces intervening. Obviously, the weather or other people will have an impact on our lives, and that isn't absent from Phantom of the Opera. But Phantom of the Opera feels very focused. There aren't a bunch of stories all happening at the same time, and each story intertwines with the others. It's just very focused. The Phantom makes a decision, which then propels all the other characters to make their own decisions, and so you get this kind of chain reaction, so everything feels kind of inevitable. It isn't like, oh, if rent was due tomorrow, this entire story would have fallen apart. Because, the only choice that could have stopped this from happening, definitively, would be the Phantom not, falling in love with Christine, I guess. Because from then on, every choice that he made other characters make choices, which made him make choices. And so who's to say if one of the characters had done one thing differently, the entire story could have turned out differently, or, the exact same. Because that's human interaction is very hard to predict. So because it's entirely based on characters making choices to influence other choices, it makes it all feel very inevitable. Like, there isn't a good point to say, oh, well, we should have just stopped it there. That's very easy to fix, because it's not. Because, well, yeah, I guess, but that character was only doing what they did because of this other thing that this character did. So, it feels very organic, and it feels very inevitable. Looking back, but also in the moment, you realize there isn't a way we could have stopped this. There's some shows where even when you're watching, hey, if this character does this, this entire problem goes away. And so you're spending the rest of the show enjoying it, probably, but going, yeah, but this didn't need to happen. Whereas with Phantom, you get this idea of, that there isn't anything that any character could do to stop what's going on necessarily, because who knows how the other characters would react, because that's the only thing that matters here, is how the characters react to what other characters do. Something else that's interesting about this show is that the music isn't very fluid in and out of the dialogue scenes. There are some shows where every song feels inevitable, there are lots of vamps, that's musical scoring underneath dialogue. It's generally one or two measures that just kind of keeps repeating as characters talk, so that way a song starts before it actually starts, and so when characters start singing, it feels less jarring because you've already been hearing the music. It's a natural extension to go from talking over music to singing over music. And even when there isn't a vamp, it feels very natural to go from speaking to singing and back again. Some musicals are almost entirely sung to, like Hamilton, so dialogue is weird. Some aren't entirely sung to, but just have very natural transitions, and Phantom doesn't. And I think that that's okay. I think that that's almost by design, at least the way I'm hearing it, because they kind of start and end very abruptly. You don't get any sort of fading in, you don't get any sort of vamps, you don't get any sort of, intro bars where the music starts and then they start singing. It generally is pretty, music starts and then I start singing, and I'm talking, and then music starts and I start singing. And I think that that's a very deliberate choice on the part of the writers to make these songs a kind of sudden start and stop, because you get this kind of sense of concealment, almost like you're wearing a mask. I get it, that's a Phantom joke, the Phantom wears a mask. Anyway, you get this kind of sense of concealment where you don't know exactly what's going on in any of the characters' heads until they start talking. And so by going from the dialogue scenes where they're talking but you don't know exactly what's going on, to very abruptly going into I'm singing and I'm expressing my inner emotions, and it's much more, it's heightened. Like I've talked about before, music heightens emotions and heightens scenes. So by starting the music abruptly, you get this kind of sense of, alright, now we're suddenly getting let into their emotions. And so, because there's so much concealment, because there's so many secrets among the three of them, no one's really telling any of the other people anything, it becomes very confusing for the characters, and we start to see that not in confusion in the audience, but more so in the idea that we know that none of the other characters know anything. The characters are singing to each other, but they're singing their emotions in a way that they wouldn't necessarily get otherwise. So by going very abruptly from talking with that kind of secrecy to singing our full emotions in these songs that are very, very good, I'll get to those in a moment, but aren't really connected and don't really transition very fluidly from the dialogue to the music, it gives you that kind of sense of unmasking. Get it? The Phantom takes off his mask at one point. It's a Phantom joke. Yeah. Again. you get this kind of sense of unmasking, where you get to see inside their brain and inside their heart and see what's going on, and then you kind of go back to, and now we're talking, and I don't know what's going on in your head anymore. And I think that's a very smart choice to kind of create these kind of two opposites, because it's what drives the entire show, where no one really knows exactly what's going on, so every choice that's made, in addition to being so important to the rest of the plot, is very surprising. It's a hard show to predict, because A, these characters are so unpredictable, but also, they're not telling anybody anything. So not only can we not guess based on their past behavior, but there also aren't any scenes that say, oh, I'm going to go talk to the Phantom. A lot of them just go do things, and so it's much more of a surprise when things happen, and I think that surprise continues into the choice of when to start the music, and when to place the music, but also when to start the music. So it is a surprise when things happen, because there wasn't really any way to predict it, because there's not a good way to see outside of the songs, which start and stop very abruptly, what they're thinking. Today's episode is sponsored by Supernatural Sweepers. If you run an opera house in Paris that's haunted by a mysterious phantom, chances are he's going to break some things, like a chandelier he drops from the ceiling. And if you're trying to put on a show later that day, you probably don't have the resources to clean it all up in time for your audience to show up, which is why Supernatural Sweepers is so handy. Just kind of shout, and they'll hop on over to your theater and clean it all up for you. And no, they're not Ghostbusters. They're very different. These ones exist in the early 1990s. Let's talk about some music, shall we? The music of Phantom of the Opera is obviously very good. Much like the story structure itself, it has its own unique sound, where it feels just as at home being an opera as it does rock and very synth heavy. It's not the first to be a rock opera, I'm sure, and it probably won't be the last. But in my opinion, I don't think there are any shows that do the rock opera better than the Phantom of the Opera, because Andrew Lloyd Webber and his creative team have such a pulse on the balance between the two. You know, there are plenty of astounding opera solos like this one.
There will never be a day when I won't be cool.
But then you also have this kind of very synth-heavy rock sound, like this part. The thing that works so well about this score is that every song does exactly what it needs to. There are some songs that feel very small and intimate, like Think of Me.
Think of me fondly when we've said goodbye.
There are some songs that are big and showy, like Masquerade. You also have the title song, Phantom of the Opera.
Sing once again with me our strange duet. My power over you grows stronger yet.
Which I think is the epitome of what this show does so well with this music, because the backing sounds so rock. It's synth heavy, it is intense, it sounds like, well, rock. But then when the characters start singing, it sounds very opera-ish. So what you end up with is this really, really cool mix of this operatic singing and this rock, synth-heavy backing, which is, well, a rock opera. But I think that this is the very definition of what a rock opera can be, because it doesn't soften the opera. It sounds just as beautiful and as breathtaking as operas often do. It may not be the most powerful song in opera, but it is definitely a huge opera song. But it also doesn't soften the rock any. It doesn't say, oh, let's tone it down a little bit, let's make it sound a little bit more like opera. It just goes, let's have a rock backing and opera singing. And that's something that definitely shouldn't work, but totally does, and it sounds so cool. It's probably my favorite song in the show. I've talked before about how good music is at elevating emotion, but it's not just good at it when it's a character's emotion. It also helps to more clearly define what emotion the audience should be feeling, you know, what the writers want them to be feeling. And Phantom has such a great example of this at the beginning of Angel of Music.
Bravi, bravi, bravissimi.
because you have this kind of chilling chord, and you have this kind of spooky singing. I'm not sure it's spooky singing. Anyway, spooky singing, which gives you this sense of dread, this sense of, okay, something is happening here, and I don't know what it is, but it's scary. And the music helps to define that way better than just talking, because, just having the Phantom just kind of stand there and say, I am the Phantom, and I'm scary, wouldn't have been nearly as impactful as him singing these lyrics in this kind of foreboding manner under this really unsettling chord. But then we transfer back to a beautiful opera. And so I think that not only can the music elevate the sense of uneasiness that you have when hearing the Phantom sing to Christine without Christine knowing he's there, you also have this sense of confusion and of almost kind of disorientation because of the very abrupt flip between moods. 1 minute we're uneasy, we're nervous, and then we're back to happy-go-lucky opera that's very beautiful and sounds pretty. Okay, so what is that going to mean? And I think that moment almost helps to elevate the entire song and the entire show even, because, the Phantom is scary, but also the fact that nobody knows he's there is almost scarier, I think. And this isn't a scary show necessarily. But it's uneasy. You know there's something there, and before you meet the Phantom, you don't know what he's gonna do. You have no idea who the Phantom is, and so you're uncertain about his intent. He's singing, but who is he? What is he going to do? I'm uneasy, and then all of a sudden everything's back to normal, but you know that it's not, and so going that abruptly back to quote-unquote normal makes it almost worse, because we're not just here saying, oh, things are scary, ta-da, now we're here, things are scary, and now, very quickly, you have like 5 seconds of scariness before you go back to the opera, and it's like, okay, so there's something here, and we don't know what's happening, and the fact that we know that something is happening, but not what, is very precise, and helps to elevate the audience's emotion and the audience's understanding of how little they and the characters alongside them know about what's going on with the Phantom, and that moment would not have hit nearly as well without music. The music also helps to elevate the character of the Phantom, because we can understand him more. I mentioned that songs help to kind of peel back the mask that all these characters are wearing sometimes, literally. Get it, because the Phantom? Yeah, anyway. You get to see this character more because you get to see how he's acting, but also what he feels inside. A great example of this is in All I Ask of You Reprise. It starts very soft.
I gave you my music, made your song take wing, and now.
And you eventually hear the Phantom start to kind of sing his innermost thoughts, and you start to feel bad for him. You start to think, he really is just a character that is in love and wants people to hear his music, and he's a musician, so you start to empathize with this character, and it gives him so much more depth. But then again, we have this abrupt change from his innermost thoughts to what he's saying to the rest of the characters, and we explode into this big, huge, evil Act 1 finale type thing, which is fitting since this is the Act 1 finale of this. Warning, evil laugh imminent. So this song does such a great job letting you into the character of the Phantom, because you get to see things you wouldn't otherwise be able to see, and it means so much more because we can see it directly from him. We don't have to try to learn or pick up on small things, or we don't have to hear a soliloquy. We just get to hear a song, and a song that can so much more accurately show us what he's feeling, not just by what he says, but also by the emotion of the music. We can hear the softness, we can hear the vulnerability, we can hear the sadness, which makes it feel so much more intimate and so much more emotional and so much more impactful, because we feel like we're right there with him. We feel like we're experiencing those emotions too, not just alongside him, we're all feeling them with him. And so then when we go back to this kind of big evil ha-ha-ha-ha-ness, it becomes so much more impactful, even more so, because we know now that there is depth to him, that he isn't just evil, he is well, I guess not a person. Is a Phantom a person? being that has feelings, that has this depth. And so now we're almost rooting for him to get what he wants, but now he's like, okay, no, but now we don't anymore. Which makes him so much more complex and so much more of a better written character. But what's also very interesting is that this is the last song of Act 1, which means that we are only finding this out about him at the end of Act 1. And so, by waiting this long to learn that much about him, it makes him so much more of a puzzle, because from the start we know who the Phantom is, but then hearing this inner monologue of sorts from him completely changes our opinion of him. But then, we see that he's not actually changed, that depth, that vulnerability has just always been there beneath the surface, behind the mask. Okay, I'm done. I promise I'm done. I'm done making these jokes. So, by waiting until the end of Act 1, it leaves to Act 2 for us all, as the audience, but also the characters, to try to put together the puzzle of who is the Phantom. Do we like him? Do we hate him? Is he super evil? Is he the best? Is he the worst? Is he struggling? Is he just a villain? What's going on with him? I think that becomes a catalyst for Act 2, and so by giving us this moment at the end of Act 1 into his internal thoughts and feelings and emotions, we can try to solve the puzzle and figure out how to stop him along with the characters, because we know there is more to him, and we don't want him to just lose because he isn't an evil villain we want to hate. We feel bad for him, and so how do we kind of balance that? And it makes it so much more of a compelling story. The actions of all these characters have been so compelling to watch for Act 1, but Act 2 puts us right in the center of it, and we can try to solve this puzzle and go on this journey with them, where we're now actively watching and actively participating in Act 2, and that's so much more compelling. And I think it's all thanks to that moment, that one song where we can hear his internal thoughts and feelings, and then we can see nothing has actually changed. We've just seen more of him and a version of him that the other characters still haven't seen. So that's a really important song, I think. And then, the finale, I don't want to give away the ending of the musical, but the finale sounds so cool. There were just so many payoffs in the finale, like this one. And this one.
It's over now, the music of the night.
And it sounds so grand. It sounds so quiet. And it really makes you feel all these emotions that you felt throughout the show, but kind of are now culminating at the end of the show, where it's pretty good to feel all these emotions. And so you're starting to understand more. And it gives you this kind of sense of reflection. You've been on this entire journey, and so now you're seeing everything that's happening kind of through a reflective lens. And you can start to look back on it and feel emotional and understand these characters because of how brilliant this finale is. And I think that it's very well written, just like the rest of the show is, because it makes you feel so active in it, and it makes you feel so invested in it, and that's the mark of a truly good writer. Phantom of the Opera works because it tells a story that seems familiar to anyone who's seen an opera, but still has its own original flair. It creates instantly iconic musical themes, has masterful performances, and has characters that seemingly everyone can relate to in some way, shape, or form, thus giving it the title of the longest running show on Broadway. Next time, I'll be taking a look at a newer musical called Be More Chill, all about a high schooler who puts a computer inside his brain to make him more popular. Until then, don't do that. I'll see you next time.